example of the different sizes of bees to look at, and then here's some natural cones. Now, the brand new cone will be almost white, and over time, I talked about, the frames, the wax gets dirty, and you probably want to switch it out. You can see that as it gets older, it gets darker and darker because it picks up, pheromones from the feed. Wax absorbs different toxins and stuff. So that's one of the reasons I won't harvest honey out of any comb that's been used for brood. But anyway, here's some examples of what comb looks like. Yeah, and it gets to where it's black. Because, honeybees, since they have exoskeletons, in order to grow, they have to shed the exoskeleton in order to grow. So when they're larvae, they're shedding exoskeletons all the time. So since it's protein, they usually end up eating that exoskeleton. In fact, most insects will turn around, especially caterpillars of any kind, will turn around and eat their exoskeletons. So you don't ever see them. But when they're going from their pupa stage to adult stage, they shed their exoskeleton, but they are no longer able to eat it. So it has to be cleaned out of that cell. Well, a lot of times they can't get it all out, so they will they'll polish the cell and they'll coat it with a little bit of propolis. So over time, the cells actually get smaller and smaller, and it gets dirtier and nastier. And if you harvest honey from that, it usually has a little bit of a taste, unpleasant taste to it. So the goal is to have nice, clean, white wax for harvesting your honey. Then we're going to briefly talk a little bit about apiary setup. One of the things that I encourage you to do with your mentor before you set up your apiary, have your mentor come out and discuss your particular site location, where you think you want to put your bees. And, we can kind of go over the pros and cons. A lot of times you don't have a whole lot of choice on where you're going to put it, but a lot of times, you can pick out several spots, and we can kind of discuss the pros and cons of the different spots. So with apiary setup, it's location, location, location. Your location may determine whether your bees thrive or die. I had one hive that seemed like it was in a really good location, but I kept having problems with queen failures, went through several queens, and then finally I moved it back about 4 foot from where it was, and the next queen thrived. I don't know whether it was a little too much shade. I did notice that, the ants had built, a nest underneath the dirt rock, but they didn't seem to be bothering the bees. But just moving it that little bit made a world of difference. So, I don't know really.
Just moving it may have disrupted whatever was causing the problem.
I don't know exactly what the problem was, but for some reason, they just weren't doing well there. So if you have a hive and it's not doing good in a location, you might need to move it just a little bit to see if that'll help. But you can kind of start with some ground rules to begin with. One of the things, especially if you live in an HOA or in a town, are you legal? A lot of times HOAs and cities have ordinances that might prohibit you from having bees. Most of them don't, but they usually have what they consider a pest ordinance. So if one of your neighbors decides they don't like the fact that you have bees and they complain, the city can come around and tell you you have to get rid of your bees, because Susie Q, 2 doors down, is terrified of bees, says she's allergic, and they're coming over here and they're attacking. So therefore, you have to get rid of your bees. So, you know, when I was in the Denton County, we actually worked with the city of Denton, and they established some rules for beekeepers, so that, you know, there was, that pest ordinance didn't apply anymore. But if they did, you know, limit how many bees you could have, how far they had to be from property lines, things like that. They were good common sense rules for, you know, if you're going to live in an urban area and you have a small backyard, it's really not a good idea, and you probably wouldn't want a beekeeper next door that had 10 hives in their backyard. Especially if you had your pool next door and your pool was constantly full of dead bees, or they came over and they stung your dog, you know, things like that. So, you know, make sure if you do live in an urban environment or an HOA that you're not going to have a problem and have to get rid of your bees right away. Consider setback distance from property lines and provisions of water sources, and the number of hives. Just good, you know, be a good neighbor. A lot of times, you know, in that situation when you're getting bees, sometimes it's good to go talk to your neighbors and see if they have a problem right off the bat. Maybe bribe them with a jar of honey. Yeah, things like that can make, you know, the relationship go a lot better. If you live out in the country, it really doesn't matter that whole much, but if you live in an urban type environment, you want to take that in consideration. Forage. Look around and see what your bees are going to get food from. One of the people I mentored, he bought a wooded lot, and you know, he actually had quite a bit of forage on his land, but when I looked out at his neighbors, it was all green desert. It was nothing but mowed pasture. I said, there's nothing up there. There's nothing. There's not even a, you know, a water, you know, a tank or anything for your bees to get water. There's no forage on any of your neighbors' property around here. And of course, he was bound and determined to bulldoze every tree and every plant on his property because he thought they were all weeds. I never did completely convince him. We wanted to plant apple trees and peach trees and pomegranates and turn it into the Garden of Eden. And most of the plants that he wanted to plant would not do well in Texas at all, and would require a lot of maintenance and a lot of water, and he had alkaline water. It was really hard to try and convince him that, you know, getting rid of all these native plants to plant this garden that you want to have is not really going to work out for you. And you know, a few months later, he's going, "Oh, my plants are dying back. I spent a lot of money on those." You know, look and see what's out there, what's available. If you have crops planted around you, you know, wheat doesn't provide anything for your bees. Cotton can be good, but if they're using a lot of chemicals, you may want to talk to them about what they're using. You know, look and see what you got as far as foraging, and that's up to 2 miles. You can plant some stuff on your place. Oh, and I brought in some vet seed if you're interested in getting some vet seed today. But you know, a lot of, like, especially like crops, a lot of them only produce blooms for short periods of time. So for instance, if you plant red clover is great. It blooms for about 2 weeks and it's done. Well, what are you going to do the rest of the year? Yeah. So you kind of got to look around to see what you got as far as forage. In town, a lot of times in town, there's good forage around. you know, you got a lot of people that have gardens and they have, you know, landscaping plants that provide good nectar, you can do very well. But I also had a guy that said he had funny looking colored honey coming in, and this was somebody that had bees in Denton. And his honey was red and blue, and kind of a strange shade of green, and a really bright yellow, and it was kind of, you know, like, what's going on? And he figured out there was a snowstone stand nearby, and people were throwing, you know, their used cups and stuff, which had this colored sugar syrup, and the bees were getting that, and he, you know, he had like red and blue honey.
It starts tasting like Coca-Cola syrup.
Yeah, you know, they'll go to, you know, convenience stores, and, you know, if there's a trash can outside and people throw their Coke cans and stuff in there, they'll go for that. Yeah. You know, what's around? What's available in your area? But they need access to food and water. You need blooming plants within a 2-mile radius around your hive. Pine forests, they don't provide much. Monocrops are good for short periods. Like I said, if it's wheat or they're raising wheat or oats, it's not going to do you any good. Yeah, corn doesn't do any good. A lot of times it can be harmful because a lot of times it's systemic pesticides in it.
GMO pesticides.
So, wildflowers and weeds are great. Yeah. And any of you that don't like weeds, you need to change your attitude about them right now. Weeds are wonderful.
They grow some really popular and travel too.
Yeah.
Because I used to mow them down, and I lived by Fort, and they didn't mow any of it. It was things I thought, oh, I have a little bit of
Brown eyed Susans.
Yeah. You know, I haven't really noticed them going a lot to the brown-eyed Susans,
Yeah.
but they love sunflowers.
Probably
They
like blue
like
lights.
goldenrod. And one of the reasons why we recommend people harvest at the latest in August in this area is because a lot of these, especially overgrazed pastures, you'll see snow on the prairie and bitterweed, and those two plants are fine for winter stores for the bees, but you don't want to eat that honey. The snow on the prairie gives it a hot taste, and the bitterweed makes it bitter. So we usually tell people to harvest before September, because usually in August is when those plants get started pretty quickly, and you know, you don't want that honey. So we don't get a whole lot. We kind of have two seasons. We got the spring flow, and then we got a little bit of fall flow. But the fall flow, because it's a lot of it's bitterweed and snow on the prairie, you want to leave that honey for the bee. Now there are some people that actually like that, or they don't have enough of those plants in their area to cause problems. But that's why you need to kind of see what's going on out in your area. Pesticides and toxins. You know, if you're close, a lot of times golf course, they treat them with all kinds of herbicides and pesticides. Landfills can be detrimental. The bees will go to the landfills and look for stuff, and you know, there could be a lot of toxins there. In our area, it seems like it's mostly cow and horse pastures. We don't have a lot of commercial type crops. Soybeans can be good, especially if they're not spraying them. If you do have somebody that's raising crops that might be sprayed in your area, you might want to have a little conversation with that farmer, let him know that you've got bees, and you know, ask him that if he is spraying anything that might be harmful, to just let you know so that you can close up your bees for the time that they're doing aerial spraying or whatever. just, long enough to protect them, and then, the next day usually it's dissipated enough where you can go ahead and turn them into
And
that.
if you do live near, growing marsh, field crops or whatever, AgriLife runs a website called hitthetarget.com. You can go in there and register your apiary location as a pesticide sensitive, location. So that crop dusters, when they are sprayers, when they are gonna spray, they're supposed to go check and see what, what pesticide sensitive areas are around where they're gonna spray.
And,
Can you repeat that, Byron?
Hitthetarget.com.
yeah, you're probably in more danger if you live closer in an urban area and you have people that are putting out pesticides and herbicides that don't have a clue and don't know how to read a label. Yeah, that's probably where there's more danger. In most cases, the farmers are aware and they're willing to work with people. So,
As a pest control technician, I was told by my employer to avoid the flower bed.
yeah. When they came out with several, I don't know if they still sell those or not, but they had these systems at home shows where they had these tubes that ran through your flower beds.
Oh, yeah.
And it automatically sprayed out poison every once in a while. And it's like, why would you do that? And then they also had the ones where they put the tubes and stuff in the walls of your house and they could connect up and spray toxins into the walls of your house. Like, I don't know. I don't think I want to do that either. But some people are very insect adverse. But, just be aware and communicate if you think there's going to be a problem. Okay? Aim for about a maximum of 4 hives on a half-acre lot. If you do more than that, you might not have enough forage available. In Cook County, for an ag evaluation, requires 6 hives for 5 working acres. Now, they take off an acre for your home, your homestead. Then you need an additional hive for every 2.5 acres. And if you have like 2.6 acres, you would need an addition for Cook County, you would need another hive. Every fraction above, the different counts, you need an extra hive. So if you have you can only have a maximum of 20 acres, which means a maximum of 12 hives if you have 20 acres. That's the highest you can go. If you have more acres than that, then you'd have to have, other ag. And all these rules are up on the Cook County ag thing. It is kind of confusing. In Cook County, the best one to talk to is Randy Jones. He's the most up on ag exemptions for bees, and he's the most reasonable person to talk to about it. He'll tell you the truth and won't give you a bunch of guff and tell you what you need to do. There's quite a few of us that have some experience with that. If you need some information, talk to me. Randy sends a lot of potential beekeepers to me because they'll go and talk to him and he'll say, call Jan Austin. She knows about bees. I know about ag exemptions, she knows about bees. So he sends all of her kinds of people to me all the time. I get a call and I'll say, I was talking to the appraisal bitches, and I said, oh, Randy Jones. Yeah, that's there's a lot of people that want to get into it for ag, and the beehives are really multiplying in the Valley View, Mountain Springs area because of ag exemptions. And that is another reason why, beekeepers need to have education, because if you have a beekeeper in your area that ends up with something like American foul brood, it can spread and affect every hive in the area, and we can all lose our bees. So being educated and talking to other beekeepers helps prevent that. That's part of our mission statement. Okay, this is out of the Beekeeper's Handbook, which you'll get a copy of, and we should get those by the next class. So you can see this picture, and this talks about ideal locations versus poor locations. And here in general, they're talking about prevailing winds, air drainage. Down here they got running water, so that provides water for the bees. So this is a pretty good setup. Your winds are coming this way. The trees help block, so they're kind of protected from cold winter winds. But they're high enough that they're not in an area where there's a lot of humidity. They've got a good water source. Over here, this is considered a poor location. The wind is coming downhill like this, but then it kind of sits stagnant down in here. And then it's in a floodplain, so you can end up with your bees being flooded out real easily here. Also, you're looking at carrying things like heavy supers up this hill, in this rough terrain, trying to bring equipment up and down. So here you got this wet, stagnant air, not a good location. So you need water. We've talked about that several times. They need it to process honey. They need to cool the hive. They'll go to the easiest source of water. So make sure that you have a ready source of water near your hive that's clean and it's there all year round. Even if you're putting it there artificially. You can run into problems with your neighbors, because if you don't have something, they might go to their swimming pool, they might go to where their air conditioner is dripping, their bird baths. I've seen bees come to my bird baths. They might go to the dog water bowl and then sting their dog. Leaky faucets, they might gather at leaky faucets. If you don't provide water first, make sure that it's not in a flood area. And I talked to somebody that was putting in hives that was talking about their house was kind of up on a hill, and then it dropped off behind it, and there's kind of a flat area there, and then there was a stream on down. One of the first, when they were talking about putting bees down there, and I said, well, that's okay, does it ever flood down there? Well, not usually. Then I talked to him about how difficult it was going to be to go up and down that fairly steep hill to get down there to work the bees and haul equipment back and forth. She ended up moving them up to the top where there was kind of like a little fence and a barrier wall to help hold the soil closer to her garage. But initially, she was planning on putting them down in that low area. And so we discussed it, and she changed her mind about what she was going to do. So if you do put it in the low area, you might have to put them up on stands. This is down in the low area where it's a floodplain. So they put it up on these stands, and they have to climb up and down this thing to get to them. And this is what happens a couple times a year. They don't even have access to it. So that's definitely not an ideal situation. The other thing, as far as, okay, we already talked about that. Sunlight. You want to make sure that they have some good sunlight. I usually like to give them some shade if possible later in the day, because in the summertime it usually gets hotter around 5 o'clock or so. So afternoon shade in Texas is good. At my outyard, I have trees on the west side, so about 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening, the bees start getting some shade. You know, the rest of the day, you know, they've got good sun, and they seem to be pretty happy there. At my house, they're in among the trees, but they get a little dappled sunlight in the summertime, and then in the wintertime, you know, the trees drop their leaves and they get more sun. With where my daughter has her hive, she had a couple that blew over once this year because of the way the wind went through there. But I've never had any hives go over in my areas, and I haven't had any problems with the ones in my outyard that has a tree line behind them on the west side. You know, part of that's making sure you got good sturdy stands. With Lori, when her 2 hives blew over, I noticed it right away. So I went out to check the mail and just looked over there, and they on their sides. She went out and gathered them up and put them back in, and it didn't seem to disturb them a whole lot. Of course, it was in the summertime. They got a little bit of rain on them, but we haven't had any more problems with them. It was just real high winds at one time. It knocked a couple of them over. The trees in that area are starting to get more mature, so eventually I don't think they'll have any problems because they'll have more wind block.
So maybe afternoon sun shaded off of them might not be a bad idea.
Yeah, just because it gets so hot here. You know, just a half a day of sunlight mainly. You know, if you want to give them sun in the summer, have it come from the east in the wintertime, you know, have face them south. Helps. Like I've said before, the reason I have most of my bees in the shade is for me, the beekeeper, because I don't like standing out there in that heat working high. So the shade makes it more pleasant for me. And the bees don't seem to care that much. That one hive, I did move it. I moved it back. It got a little bit more sun. They seem to be happier. But I've got one hive that's in the shade all of the time, and it's a good strong hive. You know, bees put beehives in hollow trees. They're not in the sun.
I can remember finding an old fallen tree on my place where it had a real nice split for a long way on it, and they were up inside a void in that thing way down in the creek bottom.
Yeah.
They seem to be. I don't know how long they thrived. I didn't know anything about them at the time, so I didn't follow that situation close. They were there for a couple of years.
Yeah, the only thing that probably would have bothered them is if they got flooded out.
Yeah.
You know, when you're selecting a location on your property, you know, just think about, you know, which way they're getting sunlight. You know, is it going to be too much? Or they have some protection from too much wind? You know, where, like I said, my outyard, it's got, you know, protection all down the west side of the whole line. And so they're facing east. There's trees on the south side, and there's at least one big juniper on the north side that kind of blocks any really strong winds coming through there, and they seem to be pretty happy.
Do we have much concern about them freezing to death?
Not nearly like they do up north. You know, if you do have a spot where it's really, really windy, you can put up some hay bales or something to kind of block it in the wintertime. But for the most part, we don't have to worry about it a whole lot. You don't have to wrap them and insulate them, you know, put bats on top of them, you don't have to do any of that kind of stuff. It just doesn't affect the weather. You don't have to worry about smoke blocking. So airflow and wind, just protect it from high exposures that'll blow into the front of the hive. You don't want that, you know, in a situation where you, especially in the wintertime where it's blowing right into the entrance. Most of the time people either face them south, southeast, or east. You can use fences, hedges, tree lines, brush lines, or terrain to provide a wind break, especially in winter. Your location, you want to make sure it doesn't have humid, stagnant air, because that can cause problems with disease, molds, and funguses. A lot of times we might have a little bit of problems. We have really humid spring with chalk brood, and that's caused by too much humidity. We'll talk more about that when we talk about diseases. Having some good airflow helps with that. You want to make sure you can access it, especially if it's an out yard. You need to have a way to get vehicle access to get in there. At home, you want to make it to where it's not that far away from wherever you're going to store your equipment and supplies. A lot of people I know that have bee yards away from the house, have like a little mule or something that they can load equipment in. For me, you know, I keep a wagon in my garage and I can pull my wagon out. When I go to the out yard, you know, I can pull in. I got the lady that whose property I put the bees on. She actually paid to have gravel put in there so I'd have a place to pull in the gate and park, because I wouldn't put any bees out there until she provided a way I could get off the road without getting stuck. So she was willing to pay for the gravel for me to be able to do that. So there, I pull my Jeep in, and I have my equipment, and I have a little folding wagon that I can load up and go work the hive. And I have a big plastic tub that I have out there that I keep things in, like some smoker fuel and a smoker and a few tools and things like that I can close up, and you know, it keeps the water out, that so I don't have to bring a pipe tool or a drain holder every time. So I keep a few things there, but not a whole lot, because I have to haul everything else in and out. But once I pull in there, it's nice and flat, and I'm able to work the bees without a problem. I got enough space behind them. Other one, leave yourself some elbow room to work around your hives. Do not jam them together tightly. You want to work from the back. You don't want to stumble around lifting heavy boxes. So I got one lady that had her beehives kind of on a slope, and then for some reason they took logs and they made like a log fence really close around the back of the hive, and she was having problems because carpenter ants were infesting her hives really, really bad. That dead logs that she had stacked up around there were encouraging those pests to come in, and she didn't leave enough space to work them from the back, so she was working them from the front. And you know, she's like, I think I need to re-clean all my hives because they're aggressive. But it wasn't that. They were mad about the ants attacking them all the time, and they were being worked from the front. So we removed the logs and got her working from the back, and that helped. And then eventually she moved them to a different location that had a little bit more sun, was a flatter area. But you know, it just made it easier. So you want level ground because you're going to be lifting some heavy boxes. You don't want to end up laying on the ground on top of a box of bees. If you're in a urban area, a lot of times you want to have like the bee hives, the front, actually facing towards the fence, so that when the bees come out, it forces them to go up instead of flying straight across your neighbor's property. So if you have an area where you might have foot traffic or something that needs to pass in front of the hives, you might want to put a barrier, either shrubs or fencing or something like that, in order to force those bees to go up so that you're not having bee collisions with you when you're walking. In the summertime, the bees come around the side of my house to go back to where my ponds are. And when I walk on that side of the house, a lot of times I get bumped by bees because, they usually come in high and they go down to the pond and they fill up and they fly back low. So, if I'm walking around there, there's a narrow spot where I've got shrubs, and then I've got the side of the house and some fencing for the air conditioner. And in that narrow area, sometimes you have problems with collisions. Luckily, I don't have to go over there too often unless I'm mowing and weed whacking. You don't want that kind of thing happening if they're going and running into your neighbors. That can cause problems. Work your hives from the back or level them from side to side, to help keep away the cross-prone grazing. Help the hive slightly forward, keep water from running in the entrance. Make sure you stand stable and place a solid surface under the hive. And I've found that Durock works really good for me. It's very durable, and it's fairly cheap, and if you need to move the hive, it's easy to move. Raising your hive, so having a hive makes it easier on your back. It also helps with predators like skunks and raccoons. Ants be kept away by using cinnamon. Some people will use ashes, oil barriers around the legs. Diatomaceous earth will work as long as it's dry. As soon as it gets any rain or moisture, it won't help. I've taken diatomaceous earth though in the wintertime and put it in the screen bottom boards. I put some on the top of the insert, and that kind of helps with pests wanting to get in there. The bees can't get into it; it stays dry. But if there's moths get in there or hive beetles, that diatomaceous earth will scratch their exoskeleton and they'll dehydrate. Mice have a harder time getting into a raised hive. You can't fully protect your hives from things like fire, but you can minimize the chances by not putting your hives around stacks of old wood or in dry grass fields where you have tall grass where a fire can spread quickly. If you keep, even out of my out yard, I keep the grass around where the bees are cut close. I go out and weed whack it every minute, because the grass fires, when they go, if the grass is short, they'll go through there really quick. So they go through there really quick. It might burn the grass. It won't have to be there long enough to start the hive on fire because it'll go through so fast. So your bees should be able to survive if you have a quick grass fire go through. And there's always a chance. All it takes is one moron driving down the road and flipping a cigarette out the window.
I have a question about your
My out yard?
Out yard. Is that you fence that or anything? You got different ones with like feral hogs or anything?
I've never had anybody report having problems with hogs. They usually don't bother me.
Okay.
If you happen to have goats like to jump on things. So I keep the goats away. Horses and cattle will rub up against them and knock them over. They might only do it once, but if you have, horses, cattle, goats, you want to fence them off. They seem.
Horses and don't bother them. They'll even run up to it, but they don't bother.
It kind of depends on the horse. Yeah.
They want something to, if they got an itch and they want to scratch something, they might rub up against that.
Yeah, and knock it over. Now, if you're gonna have, you know, livestock around, it's probably a better idea to put a fence around it. The little man who was our secretary, they put up an electric fence around there to keep horses and cattle, just make them back off and stay away. So that was kind of like a bare minimum. Where my out yard is, there's a fence and a gate, but the fence is kind of worthless. That's why nobody wanted to put cattle on there anymore, and it was too overgrown. So there's, you know, I don't have any problems with the neighbors' animals really getting on there, because the neighbors, they have good fences to keep their livestock in. And, you know, the gate and stuff, I've got the bees kind of around the corner, so people really can't see them. And if they wanted in there, they'd have to crawl over the gate or, you know, cut the lock off of it in order to get there. And I haven't had any problems with people bothering it. And most of the neighbors know about the bees. They'd ask me about it. So if anything was going on, they would probably call and let me know. Lastly, you need protection from paranoid, ignorant, and irrational people. I've seen pictures where, you know, kids have come out and destroyed apiaries and thrown the beehives and ponds and things like that. So it's better to have it where it's not in a place where the general public can get to it. Kind of put it somewhere out of the way. Make sure your hive is on private property, or you have permission to use it. You just don't put it out there any place. Out of sight, out of mind. If people can't really see those hives, they're going to leave them alone. Yeah.
Does anybody have a mentor request sheet that they have not given me that they would like to?
Tim, if you hit the lights while you're back.
I just want to get as many as.
Tim, hit the lights back there for me too. It's getting dark.
Yeah,
Right there.
And I brought in some vetch seed. If it's in 5-pound bags, if you want to buy some vetch seed,